welcome. Thank you for coming. What we're going to do, actually, you are going to be doing a lot of the work today, but what we're doing is we're talking about intersectionality and we're talking about metaphor. This is awkward. I'm used to walking around a lot when I teach, and it's hard to remember to stay rooted by the microphone. What I'm going to do is to present this as much the way that I would if we were doing it as part of a class. So if we were doing this is actually a 3-hour module that can be either taught in a 3-hour class or broken down into 2.5-hour sessions if you want to do that. What I will do is to pretend that we've done a lot of the conceptual discussion the day before. So what I'm doing is sort of the recap that we would do at the beginning of a session, and then from there we will proceed with discussion and your own creative work. That intersectionality is a way of talking about diversity. We said that it's based off the concept of the mythical norm, and we named scholars like Audre Lorde and Patricia Hill Collins. And what intersectionality does basically is to talk about privilege in society and the ways that basically what we were born with affects the way that life treats us many times. Okay, now, so we said intersectionality then describes the factors of human diversity and talks about the ways that we vary from this mythical norm. Remember, we said yesterday that the mythical norm is male in contemporary Western society. It would be male, white, heterosexual. In the United States would be U.S. born, affluent, would be educated at the level of probably college or above, and would be healthy with no noted physical disabilities, and would not be a member of a religious, political, or other identified minority group that gets marginalized. All right, remember we defined, and you may want to be sure that you know the key terms on your handout when test time comes around. Intersectionality, again, we've talked about. The matrix is a pictorial way of graphing these differences that people have. Mythical norm, we've just mentioned. Privilege, we said, is unearned advantage. Okay? When we talk about social privilege, and again, when we talked about the mythical norm, people who are born into those categories tend to get a level of social privilege that not everyone does. Now, it's not because of anything they did or didn't do. It's because they happen to be born male, white, heterosexual, born in the U.S., affluent, they are well educated, they have no known disabilities at this time, and again, not a member of a minority organization that might contribute to being treated in a marginalized way. Now, remember we also said that in some ways this is a little bit more macro than micro. It has micro implications as well, but not everyone I know who is male, white, heterosexual, U.S. born, affluent, well educated with no noted disabilities feels privileged. There are people that subjectively experience difficulty at one or another of a number of areas. For instance, what happens if you are a white heterosexual U.S. born male who is getting divorced and is petitioning for custody of your child? Will you feel advantaged? No. that there's a little bit more egalitarianism now than there was, say, even 10 or 15 years ago, but still courts tend to rule in favor of mothers. Okay, we said that the ugly truth about intersectionality is that we are discriminated against according to the factors by which we deviate from this norm. Okay, so as a white heterosexual female born in the U.S., well-educated, marginally affluent, with probably not really noticeable physical disabilities unless you count being short and getting old. If I'm going to experience oppression, where am I likely to experience it? Along which of these factors of diversity? Yes, on the basis of my sex. Okay. Now, so what happens if we have someone who is male, Latino, heterosexual, not born in the U.S., not affluent but not poor, educated, say high school graduate but nothing above? Where will he be likely to face oppression? Okay. Yes. So on the basis of his nationality, we don't have a category for language, but if he speaks English as a second language, he may experience oppression around that, or may have at one time in his life. Now, so we tend to experience being oppressed by the factors for, that are in difference to the matrix. The flip side of that is that we tend to oppress people on the basis of the factors which they hold in difference, but from the perspective of the factors that we hold in common. So, again, it's not universally true, but a lot of times we do that without necessarily meaning to. Now, part of the reason for that is because the subjective reality of who we are shapes our views, our experiences from probably even before we're born. Okay? For instance, when your mother knew she was pregnant, there were probably some things that were different when she knew whether you were a boy or a girl. If you were a member of an affluent group, you probably got more onesies and maybe extra strollers or whatever than you knew what to do with. If you were born into a poor family, it might have been more difficult to get what you needed. So, okay, we all tend to think, wherever we fall on the intersection, on the matrix, we all tend to think that the rest of the world sees reality and experiences reality in the same way that we do. This isn't true. All right. It's only been within the past couple of months that the United States has recognized the right of same-sex couples to be married in all 50 states. Now, before that was the fact, did people who opposed same-sex marriage do so because they were out to be oppressive to other people? Well, some did, but not all did. Again, people might have questioned the validity of same-sex relationships based on their lack of knowledge, their lack of perception of what that's like, of what it's like to have your civil rights violated by not being able to have the life partner of your choice. Okay, so we tend to oppress people on the basis of the factors by which we adhere to the mythical norm. All right, we talked about overt and covert oppression. Remember, we said that overt oppression is that which is readily observable. If we see someone not observing ADA compliance, all right, that's overt discrimination. Whether it's intentional or not, it is outwardly observable. If we hear someone making a sexist joke, okay, that's overt, that's overt oppression. It's there, we know it. What about covert oppression? Where might we see that? Yes, political agendas. All right. When we think about, for example, some of the proposed legislation that would regulate women's procreative health, okay, that whether that's intentional or not, it certainly has the effect of threatening people's right to the control over their own bodies. Okay. When we think about, okay, I know we have people in here that are doctoral students and maybe going on the job market. Now, is it legal, if I'm interviewing you for a job, is it legal for me to ask you if you're pregnant? No. All right, so if you're 2 or 3 months pregnant, you're probably fine. If you're 8.5 months pregnant, I don't need to ask. I can look and tell. Now, regardless of fair hiring laws, people can hire or not hire somebody for pretty much any reason they want to. They need to know how to make it look good, but they can pretty much do what they cannot state their real reasons. So, if I say another applicant was better qualified, unless there are clearly identifiable factors that show that that's not true, you probably can't sue me for discrimination. Now, if you can prove that the reason I didn't hire you is because you're pregnant, then you own my agency and I get a lot of bad publicity. All right. Now, but that wouldn't be something that was outwardly stated, so it would be covert oppression. Can people, to the extent that they're comfortable sharing, talk about instances of overt or covert oppression that you may have experienced? Okay. Yes, so that would actually be, we didn't really mention microaggressions, and we probably should. Microaggressions are things that, maybe aren't, that aren't harmful in the sense of they will keep you from achieving something or doing something, but they do kind of eat away at your self-esteem. They leave you feeling treated less than, and being called little lady at 5'2", trust me, I know all about the little lady thing, doesn't leave you feeling great. That's a good example. Thank you. Yes?
The receptionist in the doctor's office last week called me honey.
Okay.
I don't hear very well either, so I said, what did you call me? Did you call me honey? Yeah, honey, I called you honey. I don't know whether that was oppression or whether she's from down south. Calls everybody honey. I don't know. So it stopped me in my tracks.
Right, and most of the time, again, when new employee orientations hopefully tell people that that's not the best thing to do, but obviously hers either didn't or she chose not to do that. Other microaggressions. Yes.
More than wanting to hear if my working papers are in order to work in the United States. And
Wow. How did you respond?
well, it's a lot of education. A lot of education, especially from people that do not know my origin. Since I'm Puerto Rican, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, so we don't need papers
Right.
to work here. But I guess they want to figure out where I am from, and the question would be if I am here working or with a visa or.
Again, if we have someone that perhaps looks as if they might come from a different nation or is of a different race, we might ask where they came from, or if, let's say we have somebody who's Asian and somebody says, oh, do you speak Japanese? Well, suppose their family's been here for 4 generations. Nobody ever asks me if I speak Gaelic because I have Ulster Scot ancestors. So why do we then assume that someone who doesn't look Euro-American is a new arrival? Okay. James, when you got married, did anyone ask you, I'm sorry, I'm assuming, but if you were, either if you are married or if you were to get married, how many people would ask you if you planned on changing your name? Probably not, probably no one, or very, very few. Occasionally now, men will hyphenate and will take their wife's name as part of their name. However, that's not real usual. The rest of us in this room, if we were getting married or when we got married, there was either, depending on when that happened, the assumption that we would take the surname of our spouse, or questions about what we plan to do about our last name. Is that a microaggression? Yes, it is. It basically assumes people's rights. It assumes that people will follow certain norms rather than just acknowledging their right to their name as they choose. Okay. If you look at the matrix, you can take just a minute to think about where you fall on that matrix and what your experiences are, what your feelings are. Where do you feel empowerment? Where do you feel oppression? Where do you feel that your perspective might be very different from that of someone else's? Either someone in your immediate circle of acquaintances, or somebody, perhaps if we think about the, again, political or social majorities of the U.S., okay? How, and everybody take just a minute to kind of think about that and locate yourself. And as you do this, think about ways in which you think other people would understand your experience, and ways in which other people would not understand your experience. Okay, sometimes it's difficult to describe our experiences in concrete words. Okay? It's hard to say, well, I belong in these categories and I've experienced this. Sometimes it's easier to do that through the use of a metaphor, a verbal metaphor, an artistic metaphor. People who are dancers, dance metaphors, sculpture, etc. Now, so a metaphor is a symbolic way of expressing generally a complex reality in a way that, one, helps other people understand the subjective experience, and two, has a tendency to make people a little bit more open and a little bit less defensive. Okay, so if people are talking about their realities, sometimes the use of metaphoric communication is something that can be extremely helpful. The poem that I've given to you is written by Nikki Giovanni. Before we actually get into the poem itself, if we were to make an assumption about Nikki Giovanni's ethnicity, what would we assume if we don't know her? Yes. She's not Italian. She's African American. So sometimes names don't tell us as much as we think they do. Sometimes the parts of town that somebody lives in or the place that somebody was born doesn't tell us what we think it does. Now, what Ms. Giovanni has done in her poem is to talk about her growing up experience as an African American female and her perceptions of the lack of genuine understanding that she receives from people who did not grow up with that same reality. Could I have a volunteer read the poem for us, please? Thank you, Yolanda.
Childhood remembrance are always a drag if you're black. You always remember things like living in Woodlawn with no inside toilet. And if you become famous or something, they never talk about how happy you were to have your mother, all to yourself, and how good the water felt when you got to your bath from one of those big tubs that folk in Chicago barbecue in. And somehow, when you talk about home, it never gets across how much you understood their feelings as the whole family attended meetings about Hollydale, and even thought you remember your biographers never understand your father's pain as he sells his stock and another dream goes, and thought you were poor. It isn't poverty that concerns you, and thought they fought a lot. It isn't your father's drinking that makes you any difference, but only that everybody is together, and you and your sister have happy birthdays and very good Christmases. And I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me, because they never understand. Black love is black wealth, and they'll probably talk about my hard childhood and never understand that all the while I was quite happy.
Thank you for doing that. Thank you. Nice job. All right, now, what do you understand about Ms. Giovanni's experience from reading her poem? What was it like to experience the world as Nikki Giovanni? Yes, ma'am.
I just understand that she feels like white people don't perceive the stress of her child.
Okay. Now, what's more powerful, to say nobody understands my experience, or to go through the way she elaborates on that? They never understand. Black love is black wealth. She's expressing her experience, and she's talking about the fact that most people just don't seem to get it. Thank you. Did I see another hand? Okay. Well, some of the things that she does. Again, she talks about the fact that it was not always an easy growing up experience. They were at least relatively poor. At least some point, they had outside plumbing. And she talks about these things that we would regard as the most notable factors of her life. If we were doing a home evaluation, we would look at, well, there's not outside water. Or not inside plumbing. It doesn't mention whether there's running water. Okay. We would notice that there was some conflict within the family. We would notice that there was probably some economic deprivation. Okay. Now, if we stick with the externals, that might be accurate enough. It's only when we stop and look at what the internal reality is that we start to understand things from Nikki Giovanni's perspective. We're not then suddenly, as we read through her poem, about halfway through, we're not looking from the outside in, but we start to be able to join her in looking from the inside out. Okay, why does she hope that no white person ever has cause to write about her? Yes?
I think they'll tell her story from a different perspective and misunderstand how it felt to her.
Yes, it will be a very distorted picture. It will not talk about the way that she experienced her reality. It will talk about the way that her reality appeared to an outsider. One of the things that Katayun Gould, who is a diversity scholar, said is that it's necessary for us to find ways of communicating about diversity that invite us to look into and not at the lives of people who differ from ourselves. And I think Nikki Giovanni does a very, very important job of this. All right. Let's take a look at one more. It talks a little bit about a different kind of social injustice. It talks about a historic event and ways that people recognize and at least tried to protest this. Okay, the poem Crossing. Who would like to read that for us, please, including the explanatory material at the beginning? Thank you.
Crossing. During the 1933 Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses, the grandmother of theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer crossed the line to buy strawberries from a Jewish grocer. Strawberries after supper tonight with cream, like the first mother, I pick forbidden fruit, risking twist and boot. No paradise here. The white father in a fury lit the pilot, split sheep from goat. Soon ashen thunderheads will float over Germany. But tonight, strawberries.
Thank you. What do you think? It does indeed.
The white father in a fury lit the pilot, split the sheep from goat. I'm literal. Literally talking about splitting the herd?
Okay. Well, if we think about the classic metaphor of separating sheep from goats, sheep are considered the desirable ones, and goats are considered the undesirables. Okay, if you're living in 1933 Germany, who are we talking about that gets separated aside and deemed undesirable? Yes. So what she's doing, actually what she does in that whole verse, is she starts to talk about the building violence, the increased segregation of Jewish people, the alludes to actually the death camps that are coming later. However, and she probably, even though she probably doesn't know on the front end just how bad things are going to get, she does realize that an unjust reality is beginning. And she makes whatever small protest she can, even if it's just going to buy strawberries. Okay, what do you think about her allusion to, like the first mother, I picked forbidden fruit?
Well, it's pretty rich if you look at what happened after he did that, and sort of the destruction that came as well as the opportunity that came. And so, if you look at her action, it foreshadows the destruction that's coming, but also maybe shows the opportunity within herself, for change, I guess, for her small action, bringing knowledge into her small world. I don't know.
Right, I'm taking action, I'm going against the rules. This has the potential to not work out well for me. And then she seems to call on a collective female wisdom and courage, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay? Can anybody in here think of a time when maybe they felt like that they stood up for something, or they refused to let themselves be put down in some way?
I remember growing up in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Catholic school. There was one black child, and just small actions of being her friend, put us both at risk.
And that took a lot of courage. Going against popular opinion, doing something that was right, and choosing to recognize the humanity and the worth and the goodness of somebody else. Good for you. Other examples people can think of.
Having, this is personal experiences for me, having families that are not even daring to request some services that they have access or right to.
Mhm.
It's very hard with undocumented and non-documented families to determine which services they have right to, because there's so little going on.
Yes.
But there's some food banks that do provide food, and I have been helping families to identify those resources when they're facing economic struggle, and it's for them it's daunting experience just to show up because they don't speak the language. They are really scared somebody's going to call the cops on them, or the migration police, and they're going to be deported. So just being strong enough and face that adversity to show up and do it, it makes me proud. I'm just observing, for
Yes.
instance, helping just if needed, as needed, especially with the language because it's hard.
Mhm.
But I'm being proud that they're doing this more and more on their own. So.
Right, and when you were telling me a little bit about it earlier, I mean, it's, again, that takes tremendous courage, because self-advocacy obviously is not always easy, and it takes the commitment to the welfare of your family and to yourself to take the risk of maybe being deported, at least putting yourself through an uncomfortable experience, to do something that, again, for someone who didn't have those barriers, might not seem like as big a deal, but for somebody that had to get up the courage to do it and to take the risk that goes with that, that's phenomenal.
And the biggest part is that these mothers are doing it for other mothers as well. So they
Wow.
kind of overcome the fear and sort of transfer that knowledge and say, I did it, we can do it together. So it's like overcoming the fear and also the sense of discrimination that they face when they're going to ask for food. And these mothers are not used to ask for anything. So it's a great lesson.
Yes, thank you. Anything else that anybody wants to share? All right, now comes the fun part. I am inviting you to create your own metaphor. You can think about either your own place on the matrix or someone else's if you want to. I've got different kinds of supplies that are available. I've got plain paper and markers and maybe some crayons if you want to do a visual metaphor, if you want to do a verbal metaphor, if you want to write a poem or a few sentences or whatever, you're invited to do that. Okay, as people are finishing up, again, this metaphor is yours. You are not required to share it, although I'm going to invite volunteers to do so. If you choose to share, you want to remember that we're being video recorded. Did anybody create a metaphor that they would like to share with the group? All right, Barbara, thank you.
Well, I did a really silly one, and then I did a serious one, and then I did one just because I missed my puppy. So I'll do the really serious one. The flowering plum tree stood alone 10 years, and now has company for all eternity. The pear tree shares its spot.
All right, thank you. And so the pear tree, do you want to tell us who?
Well, my dad died first.
Yes.
And I did a living memorial for him. That was the plum tree. And then when my mom died 10 years later, she got the pear tree, and now they're side by side.
So you constructed a metaphor, and now you've expressed that in a metaphor. That's awesome. Thank you.
You want my silly?
I'd love your silly one.
Nina Harker greets me at the door every day and pees on my feet. It is good to be so loved.
Yeah, all those canine I love you moms, yes, absolutely. Yes.
Are you sure? Okay, this is my first grade for kindergarten drawing.
Do you want to show it?
I think you wanna be able to see what else sent up here. So on top of it, the title of it is Soy Latina but also Boricua. Boricua is how Puerto Ricans are called in the Taino native language, which has been forgotten, but there's still a lot of Taino wording that are used in our common Spanish language. So that kind of make it a differentiation from the rest of Hispanic communities
Great.
all over Latin America. So that's me, and I kind of divided this into, this is a horrible map of Puerto Rico, and then a map of Georgia, where I am now, and then in terms of intersectionality of race and ethnicity, and also as wealth and the economic situation. gone for good and for not so good migrating into the U.S., into the mainland. Um, there's two hearts, one on each side, because there's the back home feeling and the family that's left behind and all these issues of friends and the life that you long but is not there anymore. So also there's the new life and how things intermingle somehow. Like,
Yes.
I call it like a transnational migration because we are able to travel back and forth from the island. So really it's like it's fluid. It's a Latina identity that is fluid, and it keeps like regenerating in the way that we communicate almost daily. We don't travel as much, but it's like you're always there because you're reading the news there. You're really getting to know what's going on in the island, and it's part of my reality as well. So it's not like I left and I'm not going back, as other migrants sadly had to do. They had
Right.
to put behind everything and not coming back. So I call it like a Puerto Rican transnational migration within the U.S. and it's really a contextual paradox. I'm trying to understand it and how it affects me and the things I do as a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really starting to make sense a little bit the more I read about it and how, sometimes we don't see ourselves as migrants because
Right.
we're U.S. citizens, but we experience almost the same situations as many other Latino migrants. And understanding that in that perspective makes me try to understand more the population I'm serving now.
Did constructing the metaphor shift where you are with the process or bring anything further to light?
I guess it's coming.
Oh yeah. Well,
Slowly.
no. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, and that either way is okay.
Yeah, it's a learning process. So I guess the more I read and the more I intervene
Mm-hmm.
with the families that see me as part of them, which I thought I was an outsider at first, but they're opening, their doors, their lives. It's beautiful, and it makes me feel, integrated with them somehow. And that kind of explains also what Latinos are in a way, because we're not one identity, well, many identities and many countries, just
Right.
exchanging these different realities. And the
Oh,
commonality,
absolutely.
aside from language, I would say is the struggle against racism and discrimination and oppression.
Well, and again, even some of the things that U.S. culture does, when we group population groups together, when we say Latino Americans, or when we say Asian Americans, when we say Native Americans, it actually groups together cultures and groups of people that maybe have some commonalities, but have at least as many differences as not. And so I think that's important, again, if we're talking about diversity and intersectionality, to realize that it's pretty Anglo-centric the way that we overgeneralize what groups are. Change is always hard because it means saying goodbye to a part of who we were, and even as we were embracing a new part of who we are. It's great. Thank you. That as a woman listening to that, I can't help thinking how horrible, how almost harassing a woman would feel if that were directed at her. And looking at when the same thing is done to a man, I'm sure it's relatively the same experience.
Not sure.
So let's play with that for a minute. Do we objectify people in the helping process just as we objectify people in the corrections process? I see heads nodding. Would anybody like to say more? Give away your adulthood. You don't get the car keys to drive back home with certain procedures. A lot of times, medical care providers are trying to, I think, get away from this. But a lot of times you'll hear medical providers refer to not Mr. Smith in room 112, but the closed head injury in room 112. Well, and that's probably that probably has some of its roots in being defensive against getting so involved that you can't be objective and can't be helpful. But from Mr. Smith's perspective, that reduces everything that he is to that injury that happened, that could happen to any of us. Again, one of the things we want to think about as we look at the matrix is how people sometimes can change their positions. I've heard several people who are active in disability rights talk about temporarily abled bodies. Okay, when we think about affluence, people's economic circumstances can change. In this country, people can be reasonably comfortable and then go into medical bankruptcy, so things can change. My poem basically talks about, it's actually a family history story. My parents got divorced before I was born. My mother never realized, and I'm glad she didn't because she would have been devastated, that actually they were never legally married because my father, forgot to divorce his first wife before he married my mom. So there are some allusions to that. I have discovered 3 wonderful siblings. I'm sorry that I didn't get to grow up with them. We were, 3 of us were pretty old by the time we found each other. The other was, the youngest was middle-aged. But one of the things that we found out, my brother is very interested in genealogy, and my youngest sister had an ongoing relationship with my father. He chose to abandon the rest of us, but even though he did end up divorcing her mother, ultimately remained connected with her. And from her, we've gotten a lot of family history and a lot of family photographs. And one of the things that we've learned, I grew up an only child, not an only child. I grew up an Anglo, well, not completely Anglo. My grandmother's surname was, maiden name was Bingson, but if you look at her picture, she is clearly Latina. She was born in Mexico City, but that got left out of the family story somehow. And so the poem is entitled Rosalia. In the photograph, you are seated on the porch, back in the shadows. Harry's out in front, tacit. Is he stern-faced or merely uncomfortable having his picture taken? When I first learned your name, I was older than you were when you died. Your grandson told my mother he had some Spanish ancestry, and through his silence, hushed your story. Perhaps he didn't know. His own father an enigma, denying wife and son. His own son following diligently in his footsteps, leaving your story to be told by a bastard great-granddaughter. Again, when I found out about her and her virtual absence on the family tree, I became very angry for her, and that part of the story, that part of our heritage got left out of the mix. All right. So from this, does metaphor, or did metaphor, help anybody? You talked a little bit about it changing some of your perception and looking at birth. Did anybody else experience change or movement or clarity as part of doing this? That's the other thing that metaphor can do. It can help us see connections that we didn't see before. So again, if you are teaching about cultural diversity, this can be a way to get people to look at their perspective and maybe to understand a little bit more about the perspectives and positions of other people. Obviously, with 5 people, we didn't get the full appreciation of that we would say if maybe we were doing this with a group of 20 people. But hopefully this helps provide some ideas for how you might want to think about the model. Again, metaphoric communication can be used for other things as well, other types of subjective experiences. If you're teaching a practice class, sometimes people like to use metaphor to talk about what's going on with them. I remember one day feeling really stressed and telling somebody, "It's a horrible day. I feel like a chameleon on a Scotch plaid blanket." So sometimes, again, metaphor can help our clients talk about their feelings, can help us maybe either understand or sometimes even laugh about where we are.